Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Souchon. I'm working full-time in the animal advocacy movement, and I'm involved in the Effective Altruism movement. The goal of this workshop is to give you some ideas on measuring your project's impact. So I'm going to cover 3 points. First, what do we mean exactly by impact? Second, how to choose relevant indicators. And third, I will give you some examples of indicator choices for some sample projects. So let's start. What do we mean by impact? When we say your project must have an impact, we mean it must contribute as much as possible to solving one or more of the world's major problems. And when considering how to intervene most effectively on the world's biggest problems, we see that there's a philosophy that has already thought about this question, which is effective altruism. So it proposes recognizing a major problem according to 3 criteria. The first one is that the problem has to be important in scale. So in the sense that it affects a large number of individuals and significantly per individual. Secondly, it is tractable, meaning it is possible to find solutions to this problem for a reasonable cost. And third, it's neglected in the sense that few resources are already allocated to solving it. So typically, animal agriculture, and particularly factory farming, is identified as one of the world's biggest problems because first, on the importance criterion, every year, 150 times more animals are killed for food than the total number of humans killed in all wars. This massive animal production contributes 14.5% to greenhouse gas emissions, driving climate change. That's more than direct transport emissions. The reason is that producing animal protein is very inefficient, in fact. You need to consume 6 plant calories to produce 1 animal calorie, because 80% of the energy extracted by the animal from the plant calorie in its feed isn't used for muscle production. It's used for heat production, vital functions, bone growth, etc. So it doesn't directly contribute to the final product. Another problem with animal agriculture is that it involves millions of hours of intense suffering for animals. To give you some benchmarks in France, here are some figures. 94 million broiler, poulet de chair, and 56 million laying hens, so les poules pondeuses, are alive at any time in French farms. Regarding fish, 43 million truites are alive at any time in French farms. And regarding mammals, for instance, 11 million pigs are alive at any time in French farms, and 95% of them are in intensive systems. So all these animals live in confinement and suffering conditions that are well known and documented and are source of important suffering. You have the Welfare Footprint Institute, so welfarefootprint.org, that notes that 11,200 hours of suffering for laying hens are experienced in conventional cages, for example. 2, on the tractability criteria. So humans here are lucky to be omnivores and able to live healthily on a 100% plant-based diet. We can do this, and so there is a quite obvious solution to the problem of animal agriculture's negative impacts. We can reduce the supply and the consumption of animal proteins, and we can increase the supply and the consumption of plant-based proteins. So it's much easier than finding, for instance, a cure for cancer. And third, on the neglectedness criterion, there are few resources currently allocated to this problem. The plant-based protein market is still very small, and it has an enormous development potential. So what effective altruism invites us to do is to think carefully about the magnitude of results when developing solutions. There can be huge differences, in fact, in impact between different solutions. For example, if you look at foodimpacts.org, you'll see that at a constant calorie count, reducing shrimp consumption, les crevettes, causes a reduction in negative impacts on the climate and animals 5 times greater than reducing egg consumption. And reducing egg consumption has an impact 4 times greater than reducing beef consumption. So depending on the product you choose to work on, you might have very different scales of impact. So I'm done with my first point on defining impact, and I now come to my second point, which is how to choose relevant indicators to measure impact. In this area, effective altruism points out 3 mistakes to avoid. So first mistake, using indicators that are popular in society but not scientifically very solid. For example, in the food sector, the general public tends to believe that eating local is very important, that a good product is a natural product, and that all ultra-processed, ultra-transformé products are bad. However, this is not what scientific studies on these subjects teach us. Food transport, even when coming from afar, contributes very little to the carbon footprint of products. So production location isn't that important, in fact. And the notion of natural or unnatural products is anti-scientific. For instance, synthetic vanillin and natural vanillin are strictly the same molecule. And finally, the notion of ultra-processed product is popular in the press, but nutritionists teach us that what really counts are nutrients. So for example, a Jimmy Joy powdered meal is a balanced meal, even if it's an ultra-processed powder. In short, I advise you to use scientifically solid indicators, particularly the carbon footprint and the suffering footprint. The second mistake is using indicators that only speak of irrelevant intermediate results. For example, if you create a browser extension that indicates on food recipe pages that you can replace animal ham with plant-based ham to reduce one's carbon footprint and welfare footprint, then the number of installations of your extension is an irrelevant indicator because people can very well install the extension but not use it. The number of substitution recommendations made by the extension isn't relevant either because we don't know if they are really followed. So on the other hand, if your extension pops up, for instance, a small survey asking people if they are really going to make the recipe, and if yes or no they are going to replace the animal ham with plant-based ham, then there we start having a relevant indicator. It's still not perfect, but it's the best that we can do. And the third mistake, it's forgetting to compare the world in which your solution exists with the world in which your solution does not exist. It is only the difference between these two worlds that constitute the impact of your project. And this is what we call counterfactual impact. We want to see a real difference between a world without your solution and a world with your solution from the point of view of final impact. So for example, if you develop a solution that increases plant-based meat sales by 100 items per week per store in one city, for instance, you must ask yourself what the people who bought these 100 items per week would have bought instead if you hadn't been there. So if 50% of them, for instance, are already vegetarians and would have bought kidney beans instead, and 50% would have bought meat instead, then your counterfactual impact is 50 items per week that genuinely replace meat consumption. So in summary, your impact measurement must rely on scientifically solid concepts, and it must try to measure truly useful things like tons of CO2 actually avoided or hours of suffering actually avoided thanks to your solution. And finally, it must be counterfactual. So if you say you avoided 1 ton of CO2, it must really mean that without you, 1 ton of CO2 would have been emitted. So I'm done with my second point on choosing relevant indicators. Now I will finish by trying to give some examples of possible projects and the associated impact measurement. So first example, you propose to retail chains to sell them a system that will allow revising their product database to correctly categorize plant-based products so as to better highlight them in dedicated categories. And here, the impact depends on the quantity of plant-based alternative purchases that this solution will trigger. So you cannot precisely know in advance, but you can do a probabilistic calculation and estimates orders of magnitude. So you can look up Fermi estimates on Wikipedia if that doesn't ring a bell. So Fermi, F-E-R-M-I. You estimate the number of additional purchases of plant-based ham, for example. Then you estimate what proportion of these additional purchases really replaces animal ham purchases. You estimate how many kilos of greenhouse gases and how many hours of suffering that saves. And you can use a tool like getguesstimate.com to do this. So getguesstimate. And the result you will get actually has a name. It's a cost effectiveness analysis. Second example, you do a technical subcontracting project for charities to offer them effective advocacy tools at a reasonable price. So for example, an automatic administrative publication analysis tool that will detect new chicken farm projects. Intensive projects, of course. So you estimate how much it would have cost in human work time for the charity's employees to discover these new farms. You look at salaries in the charity, and you estimate how much it would have cost in euros. You deduct the cost at which you sell your solution, and that tells you in the end how much money you saved the charity. Knowing that charities like the Human League, for instance, allow a hen in a cage to no longer be in a cage for almost €1, that gives you an idea of the number of hens that will suffer a bit less. Then, thanks to the Welfare Footprint Institute, you look at how many hours of suffering are saved when a hen is in a cage-free system compared to when it is in a cage, and you can thus determine the total number of suffering hours avoided. Third example, you make a tool to detect stores having the worst plant-based alternatives on animal products ratio. So same principle as for my previous example. You estimate how much time it saves charities that need this info, like L214, for example, in France. And from there, you can arrive at euros saved and then at suffering hours avoided. And there you go. So I hope this helps you. Think better about your project. And I remind you of the 3 references that I gave you. So welfarefootprint.org for the welfare footprint methodology, foodimpacts.org, and getguesstimate.com. Thank you. I guess we have some time for a discussion or questions if needed.
Thank you. So I guess you really helped us frame our innovation ideas in regard with impact for animals, the environment, and so on. But how would you advise participants to this hackathon to use impact measurement more in like economic for economic purposes, for example, so that their innovation can be impactful for corporations, distribution, for example, or restaurants or whatever. How could we use some of the effective altruism methodology in a more corporate mindset? I know it's.
If you already have an idea on your mind, just tell it. If not, I would say the same thing as in my last example, which is to estimate how much you save time in charities already working on this. If it's about innovation and, for instance, creating new products that will hopefully replace animal products, then you have to estimate if you are going to succeed in selling it in huge quantities and how much animals will be spared thanks to this innovation. And we come back to the same kind of multiplications that I already did.
Thank you.
Do you have any tips for estimating prior to actually going to market? Because what you're mentioning was things like for your browser extension, have some form, get some feedback, look at your actual impacts. But a lot of things we're doing now obviously will not actually have real data and be out there. How would you go about estimating like potential impacts?
Yes, uncertainty is a tough question in impact measurement. it's still useful to have a lower and a higher estimate and to use probabilities to build your calculations. It's still better than nothing, and just by doing this, you can discover sometimes that one project is going to be at least 10 times more impactful than another one. So it's still useful to decide what you do. Well, thank you everyone.